All right, let's jump right into a really fascinating paradox that's happening in AI right now. We've got this tiny, specialized model that's just crushing these complex reasoning puzzles. Puzzles that, for some reason, the biggest AI giants out there completely fail at. And it makes you wonder, right? It's a case where having massive scale isn't just not helping, it actually seems to be the problem.
So to really get a sense of the scale here, just look at this. On one hand, you have these titans, right? Models like DeepSeek with a staggering 671 times billion parameters. And then on the other hand, we have the little model that's the hero of our story today, the tiny recursive model, or TRM. It has just 7 million. I mean, that's not even in the same ballpark. To put that into perspective, it's kind of like comparing the brain of an elephant to the brain of an ant. And what's wild is that on certain specific tasks, the ant is absolutely winning.
And this really just drives the point home. You give these massive models a puzzle that needs strict, step-by-step logic, something like an extreme-level Sudoku, and what do they get? A flat zero, a big goose egg. See, they're built for things like creative writing, for fluency, not for following rigid, logical rules. So this isn't just some small hiccup, it's a fundamental mismatch between what the tool was designed for and the task you're giving it.
So this brings us to the heart of what we're looking at today, what we're calling the AI reasoning paradox. Why is it that these incredibly powerful, incredibly huge general-purpose models just completely fall apart on problems that seem to require precise, step-by-step logic?
Well, a huge part of the problem comes down to how they work. They're what's called autoregressive, which is just a fancy way of saying they build their answer one piece at a time, one token after another. You can think of it like building a Jenga tower. If you make one tiny mistake near the bottom, place one block just a little bit wrong, the entire structure you build on top of it is doomed. It's all going to come crashing down. And for a puzzle like Sudoku, that's exactly what happens. One wrong number in one box early on, and the entire solution is just invalid.
Okay, so knowing this was a problem, researchers started looking for a totally different way to tackle this. The first really big attempt in this direction was a model they called the Hierarchical Reasoning Model, or HRM for short. And look, it was a really important step forward, but as we're about to see, it was maybe a little overly complicated.
The main idea with HRM was, okay, let's use two separate neural networks, and they'll recurse or kind of think at different frequencies. This whole design was inspired by some pretty complex biological arguments about how the human brain might work. And you know what? It was a really novel idea, and it did perform better than the standard large language models. But it was also built on some pretty shaky foundations.
And this is where it gets really interesting, especially when you start to pick apart HRM's design. There were three key problems. First, the whole learning theory was based on this mathematical assumption that the model's thinking would eventually converge to a stable answer, a fixed point. But in practice, they only ran it for a few steps, so it never actually got there. Second, training was super inefficient. It needed 2 full forward passes just to figure out when to stop reasoning. That's a lot of wasted effort. And third, that whole justification for having 2 separate networks, it was all tied up in those complicated biological arguments, which made it really hard to tell what was actually necessary and what was just extra.
So looking at these 3 core problems, the researchers behind the next model, the tiny recursive model, asked a really simple but powerful question. What if we just strip all that complexity away? What happens if we simplify everything? And that's the key here. TRM isn't some brand new invention from scratch. It's a methodical, really elegant simplification of the ideas in HRM.
And here's the absolute game changer. Instead of just looking at the final answer and saying right or wrong, the TRM learns by back-propagating through its entire reasoning process. Think about that. It literally goes back through every single step of its thinking to see where it went off the rails. Then it uses that information to adjust its strategy for the next problem. So it's not just learning what the right answer is, it's learning how to find it.
And the results of this one change are just wow. By making that single switch, learning from the whole process instead of relying on that flawed fixed-point assumption, the accuracy on extreme Sudoku just explodes. It goes from 56.5% all the way up to a staggering 87.4%. That is a massive leap. All right, so that was the first big simplification. For the next one, the researchers asked, do we really need 2 networks? So they tested it. They swapped out HRM's 2 4-layer networks for just a single tiny 2-layer network. And guess what happened? The accuracy went up again, all while literally cutting the number of parameters in half. Less really was more. And all of this led to a much cleaner, simpler way of thinking about the problem. You can just forget all those complicated hierarchies from before. Now there are really just two things that matter. Y, which is the answer you're trying to get to, and Z, which is the reasoning process, or the steps you take to get there. It's really that simple. It's like having a destination and the map you use to find it. You need both.
Okay, so with these elegant simplifications locked in, the TRM was finally ready to be put to the test. And the results, well, they really demonstrate a powerful principle in AI design. Sometimes less really is more.
Now this is probably the most counterintuitive finding in the whole paper. The researchers actually tried making their successful tiny model bigger. They went from 2 layers to 4. And what happened? Performance went down. Why? Well, it's a classic case of what we call overfitting. See, with only about 1,000 training examples, the larger model had so much capacity that it just started to memorize the answers instead of learning the actual rules of the puzzle. The smaller model, on the other hand, was constrained. It was forced to learn the general patterns.
So, you might be asking, how in the world can a tiny 2-layer network pull off such complex reasoning? The secret is recursion. The model itself is incredibly small, but it thinks very, very deeply. By running its reasoning process over and over, it achieves what you could call an effective depth of 672 layers. So it's not about how many parameters you have, it's about the depth of the computation.
And that brings us right back to that first, just stunning comparison. On the extreme Sudoku puzzle, the 671 billion parameter giant gets a 0. The more complicated 27 million parameter HRM gets a 55%, and our elegantly simple 5 million parameter TRM, it hits a remarkable 87.4% accuracy. I mean, the data really does speak for itself here. And this wasn't just some fluke on one specific puzzle. They tried it on the ARC AGI benchmark, which is a notoriously difficult test of abstract reasoning, and the same thing happened. The tiny model consistently came out on top, even outperforming a powerhouse like Google's Gemini. It just keeps punching way, way above its weight class.
But it's important to note, it's not just about being small and recursive. The specific architecture you use inside the model really matters too. For something like Sudoku, which has a fixed grid, a simple MLP architecture worked best. But for ARC AGI, which has variable grids, the more flexible self-attention mechanism was the clear winner. So it really is about picking the right specialized tool for the right job.
Okay, so let's zoom out. What does all of this actually mean for AI? What are the bigger picture takeaways from the success of this tiny model? One of the most refreshing things about this paper is how upfront the authors are. They openly admit that they don't have a perfect, rigorous theory for why the smaller model performs better. They have a strong suspicion that it's related to overfitting, but they're very clear that this is a hypothesis, not a proven fact. And honestly, that's what the frontier of science often looks like. You get the results first, and the complete understanding comes later. So at the end of the day, this research isn't saying we should throw out all the giant LLMs. Not at all. Instead, it gives us a really powerful analogy. Think of a big LLM as a general-purpose laptop. It can do 1,000 different things pretty well. The TRM, on the other hand, is like a specialized pocket calculator. It only does one thing, structured reasoning, but it does it with incredible efficiency and accuracy. It's about having different tools for different tasks. So, if there's one core principle to take away from all of this, it's this. For specialized reasoning tasks, particularly when you don't have a ton of training data, a small model with constrained capacity that thinks deeply through recursion can actually beat a massive model that just thinks broadly. And that really leaves us with a huge, fascinating question for the future of AI. Are we trying to build a single, giant, all-knowing artificial brain? Or is the future more like a toolbox filled with a whole collection of small, efficient, highly specialized experts, where each one is perfectly designed for its own task? What this research suggests is that the toolbox approach might be way more powerful than we've been giving it credit for.